I think that the richest moments are often moments of wonder and presence
Yeah.
where you're fully in the moment and you're fully open.
Yeah.
It's that beautiful sunset. It's the birth of a child. It's an encounter with someone that gets through to us,
Totally.
that helps us open back up.
Yeah.
But I grew up in a small dairy farm in central Pennsylvania. And like I said, I've always been a daydreamy kid. But
Yeah.
growing up on a farm, you spend a lot of time doing farm work and being out in nature, being around animals. So I think that my childhood was spent between having my nose in a book
Yeah.
and being working underneath a
Yeah.
cow milking it. You see a lot of death and disease
Yeah.
working on a farm. There's nothing simply sentimental about actually being there. The experience of the sublime is this experience of overwhelming otherness.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Circling Dialogos. If you are inspired by what we talk about on this channel and want to dive deeper and in fellowship with others, there's a number of ways you can do that. One is to become my client and work one-on-one with me. We also have circling events every week open to the public. We also do weekend intensives for circling every 4 to 6 weeks or so. And we have a year-long Art of Circling practitioner training program. We also have self-study programs that you can do at your own pace. All the relevant links, including my email, is below in the show notes. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Three. Of course, this is the first. So for everyone, this is the first time that we're meeting. And then we started talking. Of course, we started diving right in. So I was like, oh, I better start recording. So welcome, my friend. I'm really pleased that we're in a conversation together. I had already read your book, Wonder Strikes, about diving deep and thinking along. And I would even say furthering and deepening the thought of Desmond, specifically about really going deep into his notion about wonder and how fundamental that is for Desmond and how fundamental that is for our own reality as human beings and how it relates to literature and all the different things that you went through in that book. I thought was extraordinary. And then apparently you had seen my conversation with John Vervaeke about Desmond, and you wrote and you're like, hey, like that was really great. Check out this author. I wish I would have known about Hartman before I wrote this book. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, I've read your book. Why don't you come on? Let's talk about your work and who you are. And it sounds like a perfect person to be in whatever this kind of self-aware conversation that seems to be going on right now is. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Guy, and thank you for the kind words. I've enjoyed listening to your videos and I've benefited from them. And I think that the kind of work that you're doing that has a clear payoff in people's lives, how to live more presently, how to
Mm,
be more attuned and attentive,
yeah.
that's the kind of work that I find the most inspiring and that I feel like I need in my own life. So thank you for that. And thank you for bringing Desmond into that conversation because I do think he's a tremendous resource.
Yeah, totally. I sense it doesn't surprise me that you picked up on that strand in my conversations about the actual practice part, the
Yeah.
not just the theoretical and the heavy duty philosophy, but the way that it helps us situate ourselves to be more present and open in our lives, right? And reading some of the articles that you sent me, I know two of them. One of the things I really appreciated it was how much you brought uh, your own like concrete situation right into the mix. I think you opened up one with where it all started for you when the gas station like talked to you while you were getting gas, right? And this your experiences with screens and your struggles to be present, and then yelling at your kids because they disturbed you and trying to be present, practicing being present.
Yeah.
That kind of,
Yeah.
I really get the sense that you're at stake in your work. your, like, the way that you live, the way that you think, the way that you relate to your kids, that the work that you're doing philosophically is really what's at stake for you. Is this is really about your life. And I also hear you talk about the practices and emphasize the way that, where, precisely where Desmond emphasizes, no, this is about the personal encounter with being profoundly present with what's most real, which is always the case. That's always central for us at every single moment. So it brings it really home into the personal and the intersubjective of our lives. So I think I hear that tone in your work and in your scholarship. And I think one of the reasons why I hear it too is because it's not that common, actually, in my experience, at least explicitly in people's work. So I was really appreciating that.
Yeah, and I think that's an astute remark. And I do think that I'm someone that has struggled a lot with being attentive. I think even as a little kid, I was very given to daydreaming, and my mother would tell me to do something, and then 5 minutes later, I would still be off in sort of Steve world, and she'd
Yeah.
have to call me back. And some of that is good. I think that some creative work can be born out of that kind of reverie for sure. But unfortunately, the darker side of that has been struggles with being present. And in my own life, I think that the richest moments are often moments of wonder and presence where you're fully in the moment and you're fully open.
Yeah.
But I also think that in order to be an ethical person, we have to be open to other people. There's a way in which ethics, as Iris Murdoch would say, and Desmond would agree, I think, is in a large part a matter of attention, at least in terms of a prefatory step. If you're
Yeah.
not attentive to others, if you're not open to others, you're not going to treat them in the fullest way that you could.
Yeah.
So we were talking a little bit before the video began about fatherhood, about having kids. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I wrote this book in the wake of my older two daughters' births.
Mm.
And I think that it was a matter of trying to be present to them, but also seeing the ways I haven't been present to them, but
Mm.
also doing justice to the wonder of birth. And wonder is such a big topic for Desmond. It's one of these things that totally shake all of your
Yeah.
preconceptions, your sense of your life, and it opens you up to this new person
Yeah.
that's just there. And Desmond is certainly a great systematic thinker, and he can go deep into the philosophical conversation and argue about concepts and about fine distinctions, and that's important. And we'll probably talk a little bit about that as well. But
Yeah.
he's also an interesting thinker in that he's a metaphysician, a systematic thinker, but also a phenomenologist. And
Mm.
maybe that's the avenue that I'm approaching him through first,
Yeah.
is he's very attentive to
Yeah.
experiences of wonder and experiences of being closed off and numb, experiences of relationship.
Yeah.
So he gives us a rich set of resources for thinking about those, but I do think too that he gives us some practices for it.
Right.
I don't want to go on and on, but I might just put two concepts on the table
Yeah.
for listeners that I think are helpful. One is Desmond's basic conception of the human is that we are open holes. We're porous, to
Yeah.
use this language that he likes. And it's good language. It's this idea that on several different levels,
Mm.
we are not closed off from the world and others.
Yeah.
We're constitutively open to it.
Yeah.
Think about how you have to breathe in order to live or eat in order to live. Think about how your skin is truly porous. So even
Yeah.
on that biological level, there's a truth there.
Yeah.
But think too about how so much of our own sense of self is shaped in our relationship with others. Or think about how something like memory, you don't just evoke memories on your own inside your head usually. Often there's something out in the world that sparks that memory and stirs something deep inside you. So even in our interiority, we're porous.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that is that even though that we're constitutionally porous, we are capable of clogging that porosity. And that's where I love Desmond's metaphor, because it's just grungy, right? It makes you think of acne or something like that, the clog being all clogged up and closed off. And there
Yeah.
is a grunginess to feeling that way.
Yeah.
And this can take so many different forms, right? It might be technologically enabled, right? We're sucked into our screens that are actually not an encounter with true otherness, but via algorithms. They're an echo chamber. They're a strange mirror. We're not really open in a profound way when we're locked into the screen. Hopefully, we are in a real conversation with each other in this kind of medium. I don't want to be too categorical, but I think that when we're scrolling through social media or something like that's strangely, that's not open. That's you being stuck in yourself in a weird way.
Yeah.
But then also, some of it can be very understandable. Anxiety and depression, I think, often feel even phenomenologically like you're closed in. Uh, being caught up in your projects or worries, being caught up in ego. There's all these different varieties, all these different ways that we can clog our porosity, not
Yeah.
just as individuals, but as a society. If you're busy all the time,
Yeah.
you're going to be less porous. And certainly, there have been plenty of social critics that have pointed out the frenetic burnout pace of our society.
Yeah.
Uh, so there are all kinds of ways that our porosity can be clogged.
Yeah.
But that leads us to Desmond's maybe central practice is as an ascesis of our porosity, right? How do we open ourselves back up?
Yeah.
And he offers various ways to do that.
Is that word ascesis?
Yeah, that's what I would say. Like an ascetic practice, right? How do you go in and
Yeah.
try to cleanse that porosity?
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
already nuance has to be called for because he may not have liked how I just put that because it's not only something that you can do for yourself or even primarily, even though I do think there are practices that encourage it.
Yeah.
There's a way in which our
Huh.
porosity is often a gift of otherness, right? It's that beautiful sunset. It's the birth of a child. It's an encounter with someone that gets through to us
Totally.
that helps us open back up.
Yeah.
But there are definitely two ways that we can try to be more attentive and cultivate attention, cultivate porosity.
Yeah. There was something you just did when you were speaking. I want to double click on really quick. You did something really cool. You said, I I can even hear now, Desmond maybe wouldn't like the way I put that because blah 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 blah. I think in that moment, I just felt a relationship to Desmond at some level that's like with you, right? Like he even just spoke to you right there, right? Like I get the sense that this kind of speaks to a certain kind of porosity between you and him and his work on your life and how close he is to you at some level. Like even he's obviously he's not literally there, but in some sense he's there with you. Can you tell me just a little bit about that relationship? I just think that's really awesome
Yeah.
and
And,
interesting.
and I think the first thing I would have to say for sure is that Desmond is such a complex and rich thinker that anything I offer is just
Yeah.
my interpretation and development
Yeah.
of it, hopefully in a way that's very attentive. And I certainly have read his works many times.
Yeah.
But I do think that he's become a dialogue partner as I'm reading him. He has an inimitable voice. And I think it also speaks to what you were saying about how I approach his work when I'm writing about him, which is informed by trying to live it out, trying to do the most I can with it to let me step that back and say it maybe this way. When I encountered Desmond and really got into him, I was like, this is a rich thinker. I want to see how much
Yeah.
traction I can get on life via this thinker.
Yeah.
And so just try to think with him. He does become a dialogue partner like that. He has his own idea of a companion thinker. And
Yeah.
sometimes a companion thinker can be more hostile. I think for him, he has such a vexed relationship, both incredibly indebted and in many ways sympathetic to Hegel, but super critical. But that's a companion thinker through and through. But
Yeah.
there also can be companion thinkers that you take more as your guide
Yeah.
and you try to learn from them. And
Yeah.
that's certainly how I've approached Desmond's work, not uncritically. I do have points where I would like to take things maybe in a different direction, or I have questions for him. But yeah, trying to
Huh.
read sympathetically and read for a sense of what I can learn from him and how I can extend that. Also, I've gotten to know him a little bit, but I feel like in a way, when I met him, and he is such a generous man, he is someone that when you meet him, you can tell that he too has lived this porosity, this attentiveness, this hospitality to others. and he's really funny, and he has a great voice. But
Yeah.
his voice in real life matched up with the voice that came through, at least in moments, in his own writings.
Yeah.
So
Totally.
so
I see.
yeah, I do think that he's a dialogue partner that I think I'll carry with me throughout my life. And I think that's one of the things that we should look for in great thinkers, great artists.
Yeah.
They can become part of the conversation. Again, that idea that we're open holes, right? We're always existing in relationship.
Yeah. So yeah, I just appreciating the. It's so interesting because I never quite thought about this until now in terms of a kind of intimacy that you have when you dwell with a thinker. And I think one of the things that you pointed to that I want to draw out a little bit more was is where you talked about when you encountered Desmond's work, you're like, okay, I really want to like I really want to crawl inside this. Essentially, is what I heard you say. Is like I really want to see how much I could draw from this, in 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 how much I can live through it in some sense, and not just understand what he's saying, but understand and become part of the way he goes about saying it. Right, the way of thought. Right, it's interesting because I've talked about a lot of that about that in my own experience was really interesting because the way that I came to philosophy and this kind of deep contemplative what was through a back door. I've sat at the front door of Barnes and Nobles, right? For me, I think what was happening is what one of the things I discovered was something called that became to be called circling, which was just basically it's basic all I give you something down is about how it's a way of practicing being profoundly present with the
Yeah.
other. And it's interesting because at that time, we started having these experiences, right? That were very distinct for me. And I'm like, what the hell is this? What I ended up and in the beginning, all we had were, I would say, the language of kind of human potential movement language, right? Those were like the only hands that we had to be able to try to grip this experience. And I just kept noticing it did a little bit, right, to some degree, but then it couldn't account for this other thing that seemed to be central to the matter. And I think that tension was in me. And then I started reading Heidegger, and I didn't have any. I didn't have a background of Heidegger. I think I picked up Being in Time, which is just crazy. It's crazy to do that. But and I don't think I even understood what like Dasein was until it was like 100 pages in. But there was something about the way that he was writing and the way that he was thinking that even though I couldn't grok it, something compelled me to keep reading it. And it really caught me. And it's taken me a while to understand all of that, right? I didn't really understand it really at the time. And I think it was necessary not to understand it at the time, right? What was happening for me. But I think what it did is that that the phenomenological, especially that kind of hermeneutic phenomenology, was this language that kind of in itself was seeking a kind of intimacy, right? This kind of way that where you look in experience and it draws you into the background that's already present, and this whole being in time and the hyphens and this whole phenomenological way of presencing what is most like most close in. And I think that's what this tension that I was having with circling and then reading those two things, it totally linked up. But what's interesting is I've always felt that for me, like reading philosophy and reading Heidegger and reading Desmond, right? And people like this, on one level, I am definitely like learning things. I'm definitely like being profoundly informed, if you will. But even more importantly, the ride that they take you on to show you that or inform you of that thing is just as much of the thing as the thing that you end up understanding, right? And that ride over and over again, I think really transformed my mind, like in a huge way. And
Yeah, I think that's right.
yeah,
That's a kind of experience you can have in going deep with a certain type of philosopher who is interested in a philosophy as a way of life. And that's not to take away from uh, the value of a more speculative type of philosophy or a more sort of drilled down type of
Yeah.
philosophy. But I do think that if you lose the animating heart of philosophy as a quest for wisdom, the
Yeah.
animating attitude of philosophy as about living,
Yeah.
I think that it withers, right? And I think that the sense of wonder that animates it in its deepest roots withers at that point.
Yeah.
I'd also say that my friend Ryan Duns, who wrote an excellent book on William Desmond and Charles Taylor,
Oh,
he
yeah.
helped me see this aspect that you were just describing about Desmond, because I could certainly pick out these practices out of Desmond that he's offering to open up our porosity, practices of mindfulness, as he calls them, uh, certain types of reading practices. I'm a literature guy. But what Ryan Dunn's helped me see in a book that's very much about Desmond is offering spiritual practices, he points out that reading Desmond in and of itself and getting in to his language and getting into how he models a way of thinking and looking at things. That itself is a practice. There's an immersion in a philosopher that's itself a type of practice. If
Yes.
you read the philosopher in an open way, not necessarily an uncritical way, but an open way that allows yourself to be shaped by what you're reading, allows
Yeah.
you to undergo it. And
Yeah.
I think especially a philosopher like Desmond, I'm a literature guy.
Yeah.
So I also think about can be a very poetic writer.
Yeah.
And in in his case, I think that the poetry of his writing does a really important philosophical work because it's pointing to this richness of being that we're always only grasping in part.
Mm.
Poetic language is language that draws attention to its richness and its resistance to a simple paraphrase
Yeah.
or a simple one-to-one meaning seeking.
Yeah.
And I think in that way, there is something about how he writes poetically that is communicating
Yeah.
the vision of reality that he's trying to attune us to.
Yeah. Totally. Oh, totally.
And I do think Heidegger is up to some very similar things in his later works for sure. And certainly there's some influence from Heidegger onto Desmond in that style as well,
Yeah.
without denying that there are other important influences and that Desmond has his own
Totally.
register for that kind of poetic philosophy.
Totally. You had mentioned, I think you had mentioned being you were raised on a farm, weren't you? Like how
Yeah.
did yeah, like how did you tell us a little bit about your background about what kind of parents did you have? Were you religious when you grew up? Was like what was it like being on a farm? I know there's also something about I'd love to hear about this. You in another conversation I listened to of you were really tracking this kind of effect that when the internet came to your town, right? That added a certain effect and played a big influence on you and your work and the way you talk about things. Yeah, so what's your background? I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I grew up in a small dairy farm in central Pennsylvania. And like I said, I've always been a daydreamy kid. But
Yeah.
growing up on a farm, you spend a lot of time doing farm work and being out in nature, being around animals. So I think that my childhood was spent between having my nose in a book and being working underneath
Yeah.
a cow, milking it. So that was actually, you can make that idyllic, right? In a way that it wasn't always, right? To be on a farm, the financial pressures that go into an enterprise like that. You never know what milk prices are going to be from month to month. You
Yeah.
certainly see a lot of frustration. You see a lot of death and disease
Yeah.
working on a farm. There's nothing simply sentimental about actually being there. But it was this rich experience of connection with
Hmm.
not just having meaningful work so that the family becomes this richer experience, I think, in that kind of context
Yeah.
at times,
Yeah.
but also this richer connection with nature. I was always drawn much more to working with the animals than I was to, driving a tractor in a field or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think like many people, my parents never went to college, but are pretty remarkable people, really intelligent people, and had a lot of books around the house. But in early junior high, they sold the cows, they got out of farming, they kept the farm, and I went into a much more standard uh, teenage experience. But I think the inflection point is I'm also just old enough that as I'm going from junior high into high school, the internet is becoming a bigger and bigger part of life.
Yeah.
So I think that I felt acutely this sense of fragmentation and separation uh, from nature, from other people. Some of that's my temperament. I think some of that is having richer experiences to compare it to. Uh,
Mhm.
and I think that it took me a while to try to process that and for that to become, in one way, a part of the impetus for the kinds of scholarship that I do, the kind of writing that I do. I've listened to a great conversation recently on this podcast called the Idealist podcast, which is a
Oh, that's a really
great
good.
history of ideas podcast. And had someone on there talking about romanticism and made this great point that the romantics have this sense of fragmentation, and they're often looking to the past, whether that be childhood or an earlier time in history, for
Mhm.
resources, but it's not in the service of going backwards. It's in the service of recovering something that allows you to have a fuller existence in the present.
Yeah,
And I think that I probably had my moment of kind of nostalgia for could I go back to the farm or something like that.
yeah,
But more and more, it's become a matter of what can I reflect on from that experience to think about what allows for more fullness now.
yeah, totally. Yeah, I just would with your parents. So it sounds like they weren't they didn't go to college, right? But it sounds like they had a lot of books in your house. Did they have an account, right, about the life of the mind and why there were so many books around the house? And did they have much, did they have a, was any of that reflected upon? Did they think about that much and talk to you about it much? Or was it known of we should read books or we should think these things or,
Yeah, I think so. One thing that stands out to me is that I don't think my family was ever strikingly poor growing up, but certainly money was tight
yeah,
in
yeah,
some points.
yeah,
But my parents would always buy me a book. Every time we would go to a place with a bookstore, they would
yeah,
say, you can get a book. And I think that was remarkable. Now, on the flip side of that, I think that my parents were always said the one thing you can't be is a dairy farmer, right? So they saw all these challenges. And in
yeah,
a way, I think, yeah, maybe because of that, it took me a while to parse out what was good and bad in that experience and recover some of the good in a more robust way. But I think that grew out of their own. They had to deal with the financial side of it, and I didn't, to be
yeah,
simple,
yeah.
put simply.
Yeah,
Uh,
I would imagine that would just be, I could just get how that would really centralize a lot of significance and meaning, right, in within the family, right? If
yeah.
you're on a family farm, right, and then the struggles with like money and the necessities of those things and that conversation, like I could just feel like without that, I could just get this sense of it just being like meaning being a lot more dispersed in some sense. But I get this kind of deep part of the earth, necessary struggle, but everyone's at stake in the matter. Just having that sense of things, I think, I would imagine, is a real source of meaning, of cohesion, and even tension, and everything that comes with meaning with that.
Yeah, and I like that thinking of it as a meaning, right? Because it has a good dimension, it has a perplexing dimension, it has a dimension of suffering,
Yeah,
all of that,
yeah,
but it's meaningful, right? And I think that's something that in your work, in John's work, in Desmond's work,
yeah,
there is this sense that meaning is what you're trying to open yourself towards.
yeah, yeah,
And meaning is something that is rich and enriches life, but it's also something you undergo and suffer, right? Uh,
yeah,
coming back from milking into another example, you think about any relationship, a friendship, with a spouse, that relationship can be a great source of joy and satisfaction, but it's also something that you have to undergo and suffer. There are down times. There are times when the other is hurting and that hurts you, right? There are all these ways in which it's not a simple Hallmark card, but it's
yeah,
deeply meaningful.
yeah,
And there's a way in which you can only get the meaning if you open yourself up, not just to the fleeting joys, but to the true depths of it.
yeah, yeah,
Desmond talks a lot about he calls it, so we have this primordial porosity to being, but he also talks about the human as being both a passio essendi,
yep,
a patience of being, or even a suffering of being, We
Yeah.
undergo being
Yeah.
before we are a canata scendi or a will or act. And to to open up your porosity and to truly undergo being is not just uh, always an experience of beauty. It can be an experience of suffering in that more negative sense, but it's also where meaning is to be found.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. I heard someone once say it's that you know how meaningful something is to you to what degree you're willing to suffer for it, right?
Yeah.
There's a direct correlation with significance and your proactive willing investment of pain, right? In service of it. Yeah, totally. And that,
Yeah. Sorry.
yeah, yeah, keep going.
I was just going to say, and that doesn't have to be masochistic,
No.
but no, not at all. I
Okay.
mean, it's not like you should go out and seek it. But yeah, I think you have to be willing to risk it and bear it.
Totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
You also asked me about my religious upbringing, and I can make that short, but also I think it's funny. So I grew up going to a Methodist church, a rural Methodist church. There are many such churches in central Pennsylvania. It was a good experience. I loved the people that I was around, but it was very kind of low key. I often hungered for a stronger religious brew,
Yeah.
but on the flip side, it didn't give me any hangups, and I'm very grateful for that, right? I always had a positive experience with going to be part of this community with
Yeah.
with a sense of the sacred, even if it was a pretty tame one most of the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was formative, but I like many people of my generation, religious upbringing drifted away from it. I'm not sure I would have ever called myself an atheist, and in fact, I doubt I would have. But I returned to practicing religion
Hmm.
in adulthood.
Hmm. Is that correlate with your work with Desmond and be in your work philosophically, your return back to religion later on?
Yeah, I think so. And often in this sense of, yeah, if you have these experiences of wonder and you open yourself
Yeah.
to the world, to others, that's often an experience of the sacred.
Hmm.
And certainly, I think that institutional religion has many faults, but it also has a plus side in offering practices of prayer, of contemplation, of
Yeah.
I'm Catholic, so confession,
Yeah.
that if pursued in the right spirit,
Yeah.
can help encourage this porosity and
Yeah.
can help open yourself not only to others, but I would say to God. So yeah, I think that is important to me. Like Desmond, I'm less likely to talk about particular doctrines. I'm not a theologian in that way,
Yeah.
but a philosophy of religion that also takes inspiration from this Christian and now Catholic tradition that I'm a part of. That's
Yeah.
definitely present in my work.
Totally. Yeah, I would imagine because it seems to me that you're both you and Desmond, right? You're encountering deeply religious questions, right? At the most fundamental sense, right? And it's interesting because the especially right now with all the stuff with AI and Trump and
Sure.
it's like the rate of change is happening so quick that nothing. I think at least for me, I'm watching the news and I do not know what I'm looking at. Right?
And
There's
you will not find me making any prognostications because yeah, I feel like I'm always just caught in the whirlwind too and not sure where things are going.
yeah,
I do think there's a hunger for probably religion in both its worst forms and its good forms and the mixes in between right now. But I've been reading this book by Jean-Louis Chrétien, who is a French phenomenologist and poet, a Catholic thinker, died just a couple years ago. Remarkable thinker, very much a kindred spirit of Desmond's. But he has this book that was just published, translated by Stephen DeLay, that's called 10 Meditations on losing your breath or on catching and losing your breath. I may be getting that title not quite right, which is a shame because it's such a lyrical title.
mhm,
But he has this short essay on attention, and he begins it by saying that that when we're attentive, we don't pay attention to attention because we're so immersed in what we're doing.
yeah,
We're working on the artwork, we're into the activity, we're into the conversation and we're not paying attention to attention. There's a way in which we only pay attention to attention when we're struggling with it or when it's broken.
Yeah.
Now he's talking about that in the context of life, but the first thing I thought is, wow, notice how many thinkers are talking about attention and wonder right now.
Yeah.
It's because our relationship to these things has become deeply strained and broken.
Yeah.
But the fact that so many people are thinking about it and that work is resonating with other people suggests too that there's some hope, right? That
Yeah.
we are trying to recover something.
Yeah. 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 Totally. Totally. Yeah, totally. And when I was rereading some of Wonder Strikes this morning, and it was reading through the part about the sublime, and tell me if this is accurate, but my sense of what the sublime is something like it's the sense where there's a sense of mystery to the sublime, but it has this element of that mystery could bring you wonder, but it could also bring you horror, right? There's a sense, there's ambiguity about the sublime that seems to be really crucial in, or very close to, because wonder and horror are like, they're almost, they're very bound up together. But it hit me as I was reading that this morning, where I'd never really thought about the presence, the future imaginal presence of AI in the future has a deep, there's something deeply sublime about it. Even the sense of the singularity of like, we can start to see a horizon that we do not know what it's going to be like on the other side of that. And of course, there are people who you see all different strands of what we imagine about that, right? Everything from the techno optimists and everything from like the end of everything. But it's so interesting because I never quite thought about that experience, which is rapidly becoming more, literally exponentially becoming more the case. Like on the news, everything of like all the things that the accelerationists were talking about years ago are just literally are happening. I'm like, this is just crazy in a certain sense. But I was like, oh yeah, I didn't quite connect that with the sublime, but I think that we're inside of it, a time that is deeply not just things are sublime. We're not talking about like things and situations and circumstances are sublime. We're talking about the thing that holds circumstances together, like time itself occurring or showing up as sublime in some way. Yeah, it's just wondering if what do you think about that, right? And if we can like touch into just the notion of the sublime and its relationship to wonder and beauty and
Yeah. So it might be helpful to take just one quick step back, and hopefully this isn't just my way of ducking your question because it's a very good question. But it was actually Desmond's account of wonder that was my entryway into his thought. And I still think that if someone's thinking about a good place to start reading Desmond, there's two essays on wonder that he has. One is in his collection, The Voiding of Being,
yeah,
and one is in his collection, The Intimate Strangeness of Being.
mm,
And these essays were formative for me. And it's after I read The Intimate Strangeness of Being essay that I really launched into Desmond. The first couple times I read Desmond, I can remember getting one of his books out of the library at the University of Virginia where I did my PhD.
mm,
And I think it was Is There a Sabbath for Thought,
mm,
which is a great book, but
yeah,
I just couldn't find my entryway into it.
yeah, yeah,
But the writings on wonder, that's what sort of opened me
yeah,
into his whole project.
yeah,
So Desmond offers, I think, a very supple and nuanced account of wonder that has three modes that can overlap, or he sometimes also talks them as unfolding as a process.
yeah,
So there's all kinds of different possibilities that you can combine these. But the most basic form of wonder for him is where you might say that porosity of our being is blown wide open, and
mm,
we're astonished at the sheer richness,
yeah,
the too muchness, to use a phrase that he likes to use, the too muchness of being, the
yeah,
excess.
Yeah.
The overdeterminacy, it's another phrase he uses.
Yeah.
So in those moments of astonished wonder, this has a more affirmative dimension, but it's also the form of wonder where yourself is most dilated, you might say. So the experience of astonished wonder often is experienced as beauty or is experienced as reverence.
Yeah.
You can think of these various ways that it can have a cast over top of it, or a tone, you might say. The second mode of wonder is perplexity.
Yeah.
Here, oh, one last thing I should say about astonishment. Astonishment, maybe not explicitly, you might not actually think this, but it's underpinned by the strangeness that anything exists at all.
Yeah.
That primordial wonder
Yeah.
that you get in certainly Heidegger, but then also in Schelling or Leibniz, but is there lurking around in the philosophical tradition, I think, all over the place. It's not quite as forgotten
Yeah.
as Heidegger would like to
Yeah.
present it as at times.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is another one of Desmond's good points, I think, exegetically. But yeah, and so that astonished wonder, you're just blown away by what's before you, but also by the strangeness that this is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, you talk about the interplay between philosophy, art, and religion. Often I think all three grow out of that deepest sense of wonder, or at least that's an important
Yeah.
primordial wellspring for them, right? They need to be animated by this sense of astonishment that things are,
Yeah.
and that there's a mystery to that and an excess to that.
Yeah.
That's one form of wonder, astonishment. Perplexity is you're still struck with wonder by what's before you, but it unsettles you. You'd like to be able to figure it out, or
Yeah.
it might disturb you.
Yeah.
It might threaten you.
Yeah.
That's a second step. It's still ontologically deep because it gets down to those deepest levels of why is this, right? Why do we live in such a world? I'm porous to this. So it has these deep existential dimensions.
Totally.
And in both astonishment and perplexity, you're very much involved in the experience, right? You are being broken open by the experience. You're entangled with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The third mode of wonder is one where we have opened up a little bit more of a gap, or maybe even clogged our porosity a little bit. We're stepping back from it,
Yeah.
and now it's become a curiosity. So we had astonishment, perplexity, curiosity, a curiosity about how things work. And now we're no longer asking this deep question, why is there something rather than nothing? What's the good? Is this good? This being everything? All those kind of deep
Yeah.
existential metaphysical questions.
Yeah.
Now it's more the domain of how does this work? How can we figure this out? Can we treat the world as a problem? Which is incredibly useful, right? You've got to have that register. You've got to figure out how to make things. You've got to figure out as much as you can how to cure diseases. So that level of curiosity is important. But if that curiosity gets shorn off from those richer senses of wonder, then it becomes very instrumentalizing. It becomes reductive.
Yeah.
And then it's very easy for us as humans to treat the world as just serviceable disposability, to use another Desmond phrase, as something that's at our service and we can do with it what we will.
Yeah.
That kind of curiosity has an important part to play, but it also can go wrong, and often has gone wrong in modernity, right? Here's where Desmond would agree with any number of philosophers and social critics that see some sort of instrumental mentality, some kind of mechanistic reductionism
Mhm.
at play in modernity.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I like about how Desmond sets it up is sometimes you'll read accounts of wonder. Sometimes Heidegger is this way, where he'll pit wonder and curiosity against each other, almost as opposites, right? Or a dualism, one kind of good, one kind of bad.
Yeah.
But I'm struck by your conversation you had with John, and John talked about the experience of discovery in science. I
Yeah.
think we've all known scientists who their curiosity is grounded in this deeper, richer sense of wonder.
Mhm.
And so that's one of the advantages of Desmond's account, is that we can have these nuanced combinations.
Totally. Yeah.
Circling back around, the sublime kind of hovers between usually this experience of astonishment and this experience of perplexity, I think. There's
Yeah.
an element of affirmative wonder, astonished wonder in it, but there's also an element of threat, of danger, of unsettlement.
Yeah.
Now, I set that up that way because I don't have any answers to this, but I wonder if AI is a strange form, and the singularity are strange forms of the sublime
Yeah,
that incorporate curiosity too, in a way, right? That there's also this element of human making, of human problem solving that's been folded into those dynamics. Uh, in
yeah,
a way that might, depending if you're a techno skeptic, like I tend to be more towards that, you find that kind of horrifying and Promethean. But I
right.
think if you're a more techno optimist, you see this as, yeah, the unfolding of human potential and a kind of sublime wonder at that potential.
Yeah,
Now, one last thing I think I'd like to add about Desmond's account of the sublime, if that's all right.
please.
And I don't want to imply that the Kantian sublime leads to that kind of sublime sense at the singularity or something like that. I don't think that's necessarily at all what I want to try to suggest, even though I can see what I'm just going to say, perhaps giving people that impression. But what Desmond wants to recover is the sense that the sublime, you're actually being struck by otherness out there. And it has profound effects on you.
Yeah,
But this is one of those experiences that you're being blown open by the too muchness of the world out there. This is
yeah.
one of these experiences that leaves no doubt that you are a porous creature.
Mm.
And that's important because probably the most influential modern account of the sublime, Kant's, is so genius. And I'm going to not do justice to all of its nuances. But in Kant's account, the last move is something like we think that what's sublime is actually the thunderstorm or the cataract, the waterfall.
Mm.
We think is what's sublime is what's out there, but actually that's a subreption. And what's really sublime is the power of our own mind, that even though we're faced by this thing that makes us physically frail and that in a way overwhelms us, but our mind can summon up the concept of the infinite and things like that. So there's this level that ultimately the sublime comes back, and what we're truly wondering at is what's going on in us.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and again, that's not all wrong. Desmond would say that there's the wonder that there's something rather than nothing, but
yeah,
there's also the wonder that we can be struck by wonder by that, right? And maybe that's one way of reading Kant's turn backwards,
yeah,
uh, in a constructive way that I would value, and I suspect Desmond would too. But I'm not sure it's exactly the way Kant's setting it up.
yeah,
But Desmond wants to say no, it's not a subreption. The experience of sublime is this experience of overwhelming otherness.
yeah, totally. This is one of the things that I really appreciated about Desmond's work, and I appreciate you bringing this up. And by the way, I loved how you walked through. Probably that was about as succinct as account as I think you could probably muster with how deep it is, right? Of wonder, but this deep sense about wonder and otherness. This you, I keep there's something really I keep circling around it in Desmond's work, right? This way that in some sense one gets the sense that what this is in some sense for is for beyond itself and the realization of other than itself, this kind of mutual
Yes.
indwelling. In the sense I get this, it's funny as I'm talking about this, I just keep thinking about there's something deeply Neoplatonic in it, right? This kind of participatory, this way that Meister Erhard in his sermons, which I read quite a bit, I'm just so struck by the particular non-dualism of Neoplatonic Christianity is not the same kind of non-dualism of what at least like Western interpretations of the East, right? In some
Sure.
ways, it's not the same kind of unity. It's a this quality of where I think S. Eckhart would put it something like, yeah, when you love God, God can only love will only love God. So when you really love God, God is present in you in such a sense that he then loves himself through you. And in that moment, God's born in you and you are rebirthed in God, right? And then this kind of this procession, right? This anagogic kind of climb of this total participation with otherness, right? But otherness never, it's this otherness that never comes into a single unity and then everything's whole and complete. It's this
Yeah.
continual, in some sense, becoming, realizing, but it never becomes a something. That that relational component is, it seems to go, I just get the sense that so much of Desmond's work seems to be about elucidating that, presencing that in some sense.
Yeah, and I'm going to get even farther out of my lane trying to answer this question. And you probably should at some point, if you're interested in talking more about Desmond, you should have someone like my friend Ryan Dunn's on, who's just a lovely
Yeah.
guy to talk about, but can really get into that theological side probably in a richer way than I can. But what I would say to that is I think that Desmond would read that kind of dynamic metaxologically, right? He would say that what's going on there is that not that God, that we are totally self-mediating God right there, or that God is somehow coming into being as we have that experience in Eckhart. He would say there's a real otherness that of God that's always transcending
Yeah.
our encounter, and we're always in relationship with,
Yeah.
even as that dynamic that you're talking about is unfolding.
Yes.
That's one way, a very simple way of thinking about this term that Desmond uses a lot of the metaxological. It's this sense that many of our constituent relationships are, in a sense, inexhaustible. And certainly no more is that apparent for Desmond than in our relationship to God, right? There's no way that that in our relationship with God, there's no way we ever get to the end of God, right? Or that we've mediated into ourselves everything that God has to offer. But even bring that out of theologically, think about a good friendship. It's that I-thou relationship. If you treat someone as an it, then you have certain names and you get them and you move on. You might not think of it in that crass of a way. Hopefully you don't. But to treat someone as an thou is to realize that there's this dimension of inexhaustibility in that person. So that you've never totally figured them out, right? In this relationship, you haven't totally mediated them. And
Yeah.
this is, I'm stacking the deck and setting it up that way. And Hegel is an incredibly nuanced thinker. And there's this question of how much he acknowledges that there's an otherness that survives our mediation of it.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that Hegel frequently wants to turn back to how our interactions with the other self-mediate and transform. And there's often this turn back toward
Yeah.
the self.
Yeah.
And that's what Desmond is insisting upon, right? That the between
Yeah.
us and God, between us and others, can never be collapsed. It's always ongoing. It's always being traversed.
Yeah. 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 It's fun. It's just so interesting. It's like, just get this sense of there's something about, I think, what that thing that he holds open, right? And keeps showing over and over again, like in so many different ways with different fields, and is, I guess that's the third transcendence, is what he would call it in some sense. This ultimate otherness, this agapeic source, and also just just that he takes up agape in the way he does. I've never heard anyone do that philosophically. Personally, I had never seen really agape touched other than in theology, but I've never seen, personally, I had never really come across agape in a rigorous um, philosophical account. In fact, this is one of the things that really drew me to John's work. Was he actually does a whole, he had in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, there's a whole episode he does on agape, right? And he talks about is that love which literally births people, right? Like
Yeah.
it's, and in some sense he talked about it in a way of like when Christianity came on board, right? One of the ways offers that the reason why it came so strongly and really took hold is because they were just like, no, you can be a person, right? Through this love. And of course, at that time, not everyone was a person. So that was on offer in that agapic kind of sense of things. Yeah, good.
And I would say too that this is where Desmond is taking up philosophically profoundly Christian ideas. And he's certainly not the first to do that, though I think you're right. It's very odd or very rare to find a philosopher that treats of agape. There are some, that's another conversation, but it's rare. And it's also easy to miss just how Augustinian Desmond is, even though he says this again and again. I talked earlier about this notion of an inner porosity, right? That our inner world isn't closed off. In a sense, it's open, right?
Mm.
And at the deepest metaphysical level, it opens up into the gift of our own being and the strangeness that we are being brought into existence below the biological level at the deepest metaphysical level at any time. There's a way in which the turn inward is never just a turn inward, it's a turn to the ground if you go there deep enough. And
Totally.
Desmond would say all of the nasty stuff that, say, Freud or Schopenhauer thinks lurks inside us
Yeah.
in our deepness is there, right? But down alongside that, below that, is this opening back out into the ground of being and into God, right? And that's that Desmond, that's that Augustinian dimension. And then especially when that sort of was what draws you out and develops you, you get that Christian Neoplatonism. It seeds this eros, but for Desmond, eros is always has this potential to turn into not just a desire for the other that folds back into self, but a desire for the other that ends agapeically in affirming the other as other and
Yeah.
affirming the other as good, is affirming the good of the other, right? And that's the Agapeic turn for Desmond.
Yeah.
And again, Desmond will have places where he says that a skeptical reader, there's always an element of self-interest.
Mm.
And Desmond would say, yeah, there is probably always an element of self-interest for humans, but there are often remarkable examples. And I think a lot of people, if they're true to their own life, they can think of times when they have done things for other people that are more agapeic than self-interested.
Yeah.
There's this potential in our relationships, and it's often the highest point of our relationships when we're able to achieve that. Now,
Yeah.
I should say that this eros agape language is one of the places where there's often heated criticism or arguments around Desmond. His friend Richard Carney, they've had a long exchange about this.
Yeah.
One of my friends, he is always says, but Christian thinkers, they use eros not just as self-interested way. If you read these early Christian thinkers, they're using it as more of this affirming eros that opens outward. And I think maybe this is too flippant, but my response to that is, okay, let's just attend to the distinction that Desmond's trying to make and not turn it into a history of the term, but thinking about how that distinction between eros and agape is working in his thought. And
Yeah.
it's definitely serving a really important function.
Yeah.
And I think he's well within his rights to make it that distinction. He doesn't dualize eros and agape. Like I said, he talks about this seed of agape in eros. But then also, if we flip it around from us to how he thinks about the origin, or he thinks about God, right? He thinks about there's this agapeic element in creation because we're released into this relative freedom, right? We're sustained in our being, but we're not just simply puppets. There's something, this agapeic just in creation that just releases singular entities into
Yeah.
existence.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Totally. It's interesting because one of the things that this is, so I've been a long time meditation practitioner since my early 20s. And it's been interesting kind of reading that, like, some of Desmond's stuff about agapic and agapic mind, right?
Yes.
Really has shifted, I notice, some of the ways that I experience my practice of meditation. Because it's funny, I think I've always had a sense of being really present to the immediacy of sensation, right? Noticing labels, all that stuff, letting that go, and just trying to get to just the immediacy of becoming, bubbling up and passing away, bubbling up and passing away, right? And then feeling the thing that's constant between the two that never isn't one of the things, right?
Yeah.
But but it's almost, it's like Desmond in the way that he wrote really, in some sense, allowed me to get an experience of this kind of otherness of that, right? This sense of that there's a giving. Anything that I can call myself, I find myself already being given that I didn't give,
Yeah.
right? And that's the very movement of every single moment, right? That's the becoming of every single moment. And it's sitting with that. I've definitely started to have this more of this experience of a sense of wonder about that, but like a sense of, I don't know, it's like there's a warmth There's a warmth
Yeah.
there, right? That whereas before it wasn't warm. It was like there was just a certain sense of kind of impersonalness or something to it, like in some way. It wasn't negative, it was very expansive. But this kind of, there is an intimacy when they start to acknowledge this being given. Like in this kind of, you get to this place where you're like, there, I am so after that, right? And I can look back to, and I can't even comprehend what that is, but I am totally um, before it in some sense in this way. And it's really interesting, like how that's affected my meditation just on its own, that sense.
Yeah, and that's a nice segue into thinking about some of the actual practices you might draw from Desmond's writing.
Yeah,
So he talks about this notion of Agapeic mindfulness in a few places, or Agapeic mind.
yeah,
And even in the name there, you can see a certain, I think, wink to the East and West coming together in the title, in Agape and mindfulness.
yeah,
And it's a meditation practice in the end. He has this wonderful description of it on a beach in Ireland in his book Perplexity and Ultimacy, a very early book. So this is with him from the beginning, where he talks about standing on the beach and just allowing all the thoughts to eventually run out of his head. And as the thoughts run out, he opens himself up, and the sound of the waves and the sound of the gulls and all of these experiences of radical dilation and radical openness, radical porosity, no grasping, or as close as we can get to that. That's the experience of agapeic mind. And one of the things I love, Guy, about how you just described that is that one of the things that emerges from that might emerge as an intuition in the experience or something that you reflect on later is this sense of being given to be, right? And you experience that, but it's very easy since we are active creatures. It's very easy to lose track of how we are always belated. We're always entering a drama that's unfolding. We're always responding in a way.
yeah,
And sometimes we respond so quickly that we lose track of what's being offered. And in the Agapeic mind, you're just open.
yeah,
Uh, Now, that's a practice of attention of a particular sort. Other practices of attention might be more focused, working on poetry or working on painting. That kind of more narrowly focused attention also definitely has its role,
yeah,
but it's different, right? It's not dilated in the same way as Agapeic mind.
yeah.
And I think Desmond would say something is gained from both of those kinds of practices of attention.
Oh, yeah,
And maybe I'll add one more practice. And
yeah.
this is, I think, something that I've developed that is definitely in Desmond, but I've been very partial to this way of thinking about things. So Desmond talks about us as creatures of the passio ascendi and of the conatus ascendi, creatures of receptivity and openness, passio, undergoing, being given to be, and of striving. And I think that we can also go about our activities in a way that our striving is accompanied by openness, right? Those two things can companion each other, Desmond would say.
Or
And think
striving.
about a really great athlete.
Just real quick, you said I want to make sure I got what you said. You're striving in a company with the openness.
Yeah, you're striving in kind of a way that's still receptive.
Yeah,
You're not just narrowly insistent, you're
yeah,
still responsive, you're still supple. There's a high level of responsiveness involved.
yeah,
And think about a great athlete, right? If you're a great basketball player, you're highly responsive and supple. You're not even necessarily, even though there's a ton of intelligence going on with it, if you're thinking too much about what you need to do, you're not going to be very good, right? There's just this ongoing balancing of receptivity and responsive action. I
yes.
think the same is true of any great craftsman or dancer or conversation partner, right? So that's another type of practice one can pursue is in the more striving dimensions of life, trying to go about those in a way that maintains a certain receptivity.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. This is just this with circling, which has been is yeah, it's in its essence, it's about like how profoundly can we be with the other, right? In that sense. And there it's so interesting to me how human relations, right, are these places, right, where we can be so not present, and they can be so
Yeah.
just ultra repetitive and normative to the max, and like in all these ways that we can, that your relationship can be a place where you both mutually fall asleep or something, right? But then it's all, but the range of possibilities, yet in a conversation, right, you could say something to me that reveals something about life that I need, like I have a spiritual awakening, right? Or I can, or you could misunderstand me and it hurts your feelings so bad you need therapy for 10 years after that. There's this huge, right, possibility that seems to come up with every encounter, right? And I think one of the things I've appreciated in your writing is yourself, like your the way that you confess your struggles with being present, right? Like that it's like your struggles are like being present with your daughters and with your wife, and like that it's a real thing. And especially right now when so much is vying for our attention, to bring that sense of presence. That is, I think, in some ways, I get the sense that and tell me what you think about this, is in so many ways, Desmond is basically saying that it's that relational presence is everything, right?
Yeah.
Like it's almost like that's the whole thing. You really drew that out of in the podcast that you did about Marcel. Is it Marcel? Is that his last name? Yeah.
Yeah. I was hoping we could maybe talk a
Yeah.
little bit about Marcel.
Yeah.
And this is a great segue.
Yeah.
Uh, Gabriel Marcel, early 20th century French thinker, often called an existentialist, even though he would reject that
Yeah.
uh, title through most of his life.
Yeah.
Profound influence on Desmond. You can definitely see it in the footnotes, but Desmond has also written about Marcel, and you get the sense that this is just a very formative thinker for him. And I think that one of the things that he draws from Marcel is Marcel, along with, say, Martin Buber, is a great thinker of the I thou, of the relational we as being something that's the relationship itself is something apart from just you or me. It's not transactional. It has its own reality. But Marcel, too, he doesn't use the language of porosity, but he'll talk about being all crabbed and closed in on oneself and putting up like a shield between us and everyone else. And this is ethically bad, of course. Like we talked before, you're not going to attend to other people. But Marcel also says it cuts us off from being in its richness, in its depth, in its sense of meaning. So when you do manage to open yourself up to other people, there can be this very happy. We've talked about how it can be involve suffering, and certainly, but there can also be this happy coincidence between attending to the other and giving them the gift of that attention,
Yeah.
but also it opens you up to this much richer sense of presence, depth, of vitality.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Marcel is not an easy writer for different reasons than Desmond. Marcel is super digressive. It can be very frustrating to read Marcel. I'm not the only person that
Yeah.
has said this. Any kind of overview of Marcel you read will say he starts down an interesting chain of thought and then he has an aside, an aside. It can be very frustrating as a reader. I was interested about this first thing,
Yeah.
but if you do stick with him long enough, then he'll come back to it,
Yeah.
often in a richer way. But it can be a really hard
Yeah.
way it can be a very acquired taste, his philosophical writings.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I've noticed that with Marcel.
Yeah.
And you get one of the things that I know that he had host in, I would have been, it was Paris, right? He would host these
Yeah.
dialogues. Like he had a weekly thing, right, where a bunch of the major existentialists and different artists and stuff that would go to. So he was deeply into the conversational mode, the dialogical, right? The
Yeah.
dialogos, if you will, right? You can get that sense of, I sense that in the aliveness of his writing, right?
Yeah.
And
And
also,
I think it's also
yeah,
he wrote plays, right? And what are plays but dialogues, right?
yeah,
They're conversations. So I
yeah,
think it comes through in there as well.
yeah,
But yeah, he had a remarkable influence on thinkers of his generation. At these salons he would host, he introduced Levinas to Sartre. it was a who's who's of people that would show up at these gatherings to talk to each other.
Imagine.
And I think Marcel, he's certainly a thinker that's never totally fallen out of the conversation. But I do think he's someone that has suffered from the sense that his best insights were folded into and improved by Levinas, which not to take anything away from Levinas, who's a great thinker. I don't think that's fair to Marcel
Yeah.
or to Martin Buber, who I think sometimes maybe less so than Marcel, but suffers similarly.
Yeah.
In fact, I think one thing that Marcel and Buber offer that's I find, and Desmond has pointed out too, maybe suppler and richer than Levinas is that Levinas, the relationship with the other is always so asymmetrical that you're brought low by the other.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's a real dynamic, and there can be something that's important there. It's one possibility. But this conversation, it doesn't always seem like it leaves enough room for a more kind of equal back and forth.
Yeah.
And I think that both Buber and Marcel
Development.
have more of that.
Yeah, totally. Totally. And just that, he says his philosophy actually, his ideas come from his plays, right?
Yeah, for sure.
That makes so much sense in some deep intuitive way, right? This way where I think the way he puts it is like he sets up the play and he writes the play, and then it's out of the drama of that he receives his ideas for which he deepens philosophically, right? That's this is kind of double sense where it's like on one level he's the one that wrote the play, right? So, but then he learns from the play, right?
Yeah, he's surprised by the play, right?
Surprised by the play. It's so interesting going on there, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point, and true to artistic experience. And maybe another one of the gifts that art can give is that I think it is pretty common for artists or writers to be surprised by what they write when they go back and read it. There's a way in which, coming from the unconscious, from an experience of inspiration, you can things can get in there and it can take on a life of its own in a way, right? That's maybe in its own way testifies to the sense that our inwardness is always porous in ways that we're not fully grasping.
Totally. You know what? I moved to the Bay Area to go to art school. So I graduated from the San Francisco Art Institute, which tragically just closed. They ran out of money or something.
Oh no.
But I remember usually when people think about like a bunch of artists in a studio painting, they think of this really active thing, like they're making marks and all this stuff. But I have to say, that's not what you see at all. It's like when you walk into like the studio and there's a bunch of painters there. It's more like you see a bunch of people standing in front of the canvas, looking at it like this, looking at it like this, like backing away, smoking a cigarette, then coming back. And then after all that, picking up with the brush and maybe doing one like thing like this, or for a little like dots like that, and then putting it down, and they stand back and they look. And it's so interesting because with painting, this is definitely the case where it's not monolithic. It's not just I'm expressing myself, right? There's something inside and I'm putting out there. No, it's the mark never does exactly what you think. It always pushes back.
Yeah.
It's always either more or less than what you imagine. And the painting is this fucking relationship that won't stop. It won't stop talking with you. In fact, that's one of the things that like everyone would talk about is it's like there's an art to when you stop painting for that day, because you get sucked into that conversation and like, you can't find that end point. You end up ruining the painting. There's a whole mythology with painters around this I thou sense of the becoming of their own creation, which I think is striking in this conversation about otherness and this unresolvability, or this way that we can never subsue the other, that there's something fundamentally other and it will always be other in that way.
Yeah, and you might think about that relationship between the artist and the artwork, where you talk about the painter standing back and looking at the canvas and trying to figure out both what the unfolding artwork says back, but also maybe even what the canvas suggests.
Yeah. Totally.
it's that intermediation. That's a metaxological relationship too. It goes both ways. It's not just I have this idea that I'm going to impose.
Yeah.
It's a far more supple back and forth than that.
Yeah.
Desmond's so well attuned to that. And I have a chapter in my book called The Artist in the Between that I really explore his notion of that exchange between artist and artwork in the creative act. But
Yeah.
also he has this rich account of inspiration, the relationship between inspiration and skill. But I also got to say, Guy, that I'm such a words guy and I do write poetry. And I think that I can see some of those dynamics in certainly the written word as well.
I was
But I
just
don't know whether
that.
what I would most prefer. Like if I could either be a visual artist or a musician, I feel like that would open up whole new vistas to me. Especially visual art has really captured my imagination in recent years.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. What is your relationship with writing? You mentioned you write poetry, what as well. Is it similar to that? Is it I know some people talk about, I think I heard, is it David Bentley Hart talk the other day about, if I got this right, he says, really, I love writing. It's like when I write, I'm really writing something, right? And in some sense, he's secondarily, am I a theologian, right? It's really, I'm a writer. And I know other people like don't even, I was talking to another author that I'm going to be releasing this video, I think tomorrow, with Richard Capabino, Heideggerian scholar. And I asked him about, yeah, I never think about writing. It's all about the idea and the thought, right? The writing it just flows when it's ready to flow, but I really don't think about the writing exactly.
yeah.
What's
So
your
one thing I
what's
would like
your
to say,
what's your co-respiration with writing like? What's that? What is How do you encounter that, and how does it speak to you, and what's your relationship to writing and thinking and
yeah, and I do think that there are probably a range of experiences here. And that's one thing I like about Desmond, and I try to draw out in my book too, is just the different forms this could take. There are some writers that will famously, Muriel Spark, I think, said that she never really had to revise because she felt like she was just being dictated to by God, right? And just this beautiful prose flowed
yeah,
out of her.
yeah,
And certainly you have these more radical experiments in porous inspiration that can take really wild forms. I think about James. I briefly mentioned James Merrill, the great poet who sits at the Ouija board, right? That's a major form of his great poetic epic. That's wild, right? Mine is nothing like that. But I do think that every artist, every writer, whether they realize it or not, has this interplay of inspiration and skill and this back and forth that's unfolding between them and what's on the page or what's on the canvas, right? I don't think it's ever just a straight up
totally.
imposition. I don't think that can account for the experiences of surprise you have. Now, some of that might be going on in the mental
Yeah,
script in your head rather than literally on the page. But I
yeah,
do think there's always a between there.
yeah,
But it can take different forms. I think some really no nonsense writers hate the idea of inspiration because they think that it's an excuse to just sit around and wait for the muse to stand up, show up and show you and tell you what to write. But if you look deeper into the practices, almost always they'll do something like they're going to do some sort of free write, or they're going to go on lots of walks, right? Or they're going to force themselves to start writing so they can get into a flow, right? Inspiration can be a very subtle thing.
yeah,
But
totally.
in all of those examples, I don't think it's just a sheer imposition of will. I
Yeah,
think there is this kind of companioning that has to go on. I think there is this kind of flow that has to be achieved. And
yeah,
I think that it's something that can be, to use the classic language, you can woo the muses, but you can't force it.
yeah.
In the same way, I think that you can't just force a flow state, even if there are all kinds of practices you can do to try to open yourself to it. And I think Desmond's very good on that. And I would be open to a wide range. Asked about my own writing. I think that when I'm writing more scholarly prose,
Yeah.
it helps if I have time to let it incubate and to come out. But my life is busy with kids and jobs and things like that. So that can be more workmanlike. And then often I'll try to go back and try to make it more relish the language. But with poetry, I definitely find that it's hard to write poetry when I'm very busy and when I'm have clogged porosity and
Yeah.
when I don't have a certain contemplative space in my life. Sometimes I'll be gifted with a poem during those times, and I think gifted is the right word. but often it's when I have some breathing space and that openness returns that ideas for poetry will come. I think that maybe this says bad things about where my head is in mass, but often I'll get poem ideas in mass. And I think it's because I'm in that state of just sitting there and not really, for once, not thinking about the to-do list.
Yeah, totally.
Or maybe they're a gift from God, right? I don't know.
Absolutely.
If so, I do. If so, I don't do a very good job of. They're flawed gifts once I get my hands on them.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. So I need to start wrapping this up. It's really amazing conversation. I really appreciate you coming on.
I've thoroughly enjoyed it and learned so much from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's keep the
Thank you.
conversation going. Um, I'd love to talk with you more about who's the, because I had never actually heard of him. I think it was a Japanese name philosopher.
Oh, Byung-Chul Han,
Yeah,
the Korean German philosopher.
yeah. I'd
So
love to talk with you about him. I'm gonna check his work out. But I was like, I listened to that podcast of there's a three-way dialogue that you had about
yeah.
his work, and I was like, whoa, this is really interesting.
Yeah, and Han was the thinker that I took up after Desmond because Desmond, I think, gives us a lot of resources for thinking about technology, but he doesn't really dig into the technological problems of our moment.
Yeah,
Han is a kindred spirit in many ways, a great thinker of contemplation, but also just an astute critic and theorist of technology. So that's why I was drawn to him.
yeah, yeah. Let's keep the conversation going. That'd be really great.
Yeah, I would like that too. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you again for your work and everything that you're putting out there in the world. And let's keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.